Mrs. Thistlethorn's Mushroom House, Part 2, Making the Stove. I found this photo of a stove on Pinterest and used it as the inspiration for the stove I wanted to make for Mrs. Thistlethorn's mushroom house. I used an existing calico critter stove I had to give me an idea for the dimensions of my design. Then, keeping my inspiration piece in mind, I drew out my plans with notes and measurements for my own little wood-burning stove, hoping that Mrs. Thistlethorn would approve of it. I also used the existing calico critter stove to get an idea of the measurements I needed to make my stove, keeping in mind that I wanted it to fit into the fireplace already built into the wall of the mushroom house. Here are the front, back, and side pieces cut from mat board. I also drew in some of the details for the front of the stove and cut out the hole for the oven door. I glued the front, back, and side pieces to each other using tacky glue, and then set it into my magnetic gluing jig to make sure that it would cure squarely. I cut out a piece of mat board slightly bigger than the perimeter of the stove and beveled the edges by sanding them at an angle. I did not glue the stove top on as I still needed to add more details to it. For the base, I cut another piece of mat board the same size as the perimeter of the stove. The feet were wood beads I found in my stash, which I glued onto the corners of the base. I then tested the base piece to the bottom of the stove to make sure I liked the height and the fit. To add more detail to the stovetop, I cut a piece of white cardstock just slightly smaller than the stovetop. I used a 1-inch hole punch to punch 2 holes into the cardstock piece to simulate the cook plates. I then glued it into place, making sure that there was a beveled edge look around the front and sides of the stovetop edges. Mrs. Thistlethorn seems pleased with her stove so far. I measured and cut 2 pieces of mat board to make the 2 faux door fronts on the left stove front. I beveled the edges by sanding them at an angle and then cut 2 smaller rectangles out of cardstock and glued them into place. These 2 doors are non-functional, so they were glued into place or had previously marked. I cut another piece of mat board slightly bigger than the opening for the oven door. I once again beveled the edges by sanding at an angle. Another piece of cardstock was cut smaller than the oven door and glued in the center. Because this is a functioning door, I needed to figure out how I was going to hinge it. I cut a small piece from a toothpick and sanded the ends for a rounded look. I then cut a small strip of cardstock and wrapped it around the center of the toothpick to make the center hinge part and glued the 2 tabs together. The toothpick is still able to move inside the loop. The tab part was glued to the bottom of the inside of the door. I cut 2 more strips of cardstock and wrapped them around the toothpick, the same way I did with the center hinge, and glued the tabs together. Then, leaving a tiny bit of space on either side of the center hinge, I glued the other 2 hinges to the outside of the stove front below the oven door. I once again utilized cardstock to make the hinge for the oven door handle using the same technique, but in a T shape. I bent a piece of jewelry wire into a shape I liked and threaded it through the cardstock loop. The handle swings freely so that Mrs. Thistlethorn can easily open the oven door. I decided to add a towel bar at the top front of the stove. To do this, I cut another toothpick down to the size I wanted and rounded the ends by sanding them. I cut 2 strips of cardstock and wrapped them around the toothpick at either end and glued them onto the toothpick. The tabs were glued to the underside of the cooktop. I glued a wooden bead on each end of the towel bar. To add detail to the stove front, I glued tiny flat back rhinestones I had on hand to simulate hardware for the hinges and the knobs for the faux drawers. I was anxious to see how this little stove would look in the fireplace, so I tried it out. Perfect. Before painting, I glued the bottom piece to the underside of the stove and gave the entire piece a coat of matte Mod Podge to seal and strengthen it. While the Mod Podge was drying, I decided to work on the stovepipe. I cut a 1/2-inch diameter wood dowel to the length I needed. Then I cut 2 strips of paper in different widths and wrapped them around the dowel and glued them where I thought the pipe fittings would go best, at the base of the pipe where it would connect to the stove and somewhere in the middle of the stovepipe. While that was drying, I painted the stovetop, towel bar, knobs, hinges, and feet, and the inside of the stove with black acrylic paint. I did the same with the stovepipe when the glue had cured on the fittings. The body of the stove was painted in white acrylic paint. Once the black paint had dried, I gave all the parts painted black and almost dry brush coat of classic French gray acrylic paint, and then highlighted all those parts with metallic silver acrylic paint. Once all the paint was dry, I had to make sure that the oven door still opened and see what the stovepipe looked like when in place on top of the stove itself. Then it was time for the fun part of decorative painting of the faux drawers and the oven door. I used a variety of colors and a tiny brush to paint tiny roses and leaves on each drawer front and the door. Everything fits nicely in the fireplace. The stovepipe sits on the top of the stovetop and is kept in place by the wall that makes up the chimney. Mrs. Thistlethorn is very pleased with her pretty new stove. And after working on the stove for 10 hours and 40 minutes over a 2-day time period, here's the result. I used mat board, cardstock, printer paper, toothpicks, beads, crystal flatbacks, jewelry wire, a wooden dowel, glue, Mod Podge, and acrylic paints, all combined to create a cute little wood-burning stove that fits perfectly into Mrs. Thistlethorn's fireplace in her mushroom house. I'm very happy with the result, and so is Mrs. Thistlethorn. I am considering adding a wire rack and figuring out a way to light it up. That's part of the reason why I haven't glued down the stovetop yet. As you can see, the oven door opens and closes nicely. I started working on the stonework in the fireplace itself using cut pieces of egg carton to simulate stones. The floor will have the same stonework, and I'll be sharing that process in the next video. Next time on Cat's Meow Minis, we will work on the stone floor of Mrs. Thistlethorn's mushroom house in part 3 of this series. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.